Every song that we have ever released on this channel has been using drums, but we've never actually used a drummer. So I want to talk today about how we go about making our drums using MIDI. So we've talked about MIDI before, and I'll not go over really what MIDI is. The idea of it is just that you can make instruments do stuff without actually having the instruments. You can have brass, you can have drums, you can have piano, all just coming out of your computer. So I want to talk today about how to write drums if you aren't actually a drummer, because there are ways of having drums. It's just, if you've got a drum kit there, it doesn't mean that you know how to play it. So I kind of want to just talk about the basics of drumming, essentially, but for non-drummers. So if you aren't a drummer, you don't need to know all the technique and stuff. If you're just using MIDI drums, here's how you can use it. So the most basic thing is the idea of basic rhythm. So in Western society, so that's our thing, England, America, this side of the world, most beats that we use in our type of music accent on beat 2 and beat 4. So that'll be 1, 2, 3, 4. You can notice this by, if you're in a crowd and they get a clap going, a lot of the times the clap will be on beats 2 and 4. So it's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. That's the kind of, that's the groovy way of doing it. The other one would just be, which is just to the beat every single time. So generally you would accent on beat 2 and beat 4. The part of the drum kit that's really used for accenting is the snare drum. So if you do the snare drum on beat 2 and beat 4, and then you do the kick drum on beat 1 and beat 3 to kind of do 1, 2, 3, 4, that's a basic, the basic drum beat. Here's what it sounds like. So that sounds a little bit, I don't know, boring, bit shit, sounds like slaves. So obviously you're going to want to spice it up a little bit. The best way of doing that while keeping that same beat is just to add a cymbal. So we could add a hi-hat. There's a few different things that you can do with the hi-hat. You could either do it so that you've got the hi-hat on 1, 2, 3, 4, like you're doing the kick, snare, kick, snare. You've also got the hi-hat on every single one of those. Or you could do it so that you've got the hi-hat doing the 1 and. So you've got 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. It's up to you, it all depends on what song you're doing. I'll show you both so you kind of get what it sounds like. Cool, sounding better, it sounds like an actual drum beat now. However, still a little bit boring, isn't it? Just that 1, 2, 3, 4. So, if you want to keep the accent on 2 and 4, generally you'd want to, what you can actually do is with the kick drum, kind of mess around a little bit. Maybe don't have it on 1 and 3, maybe have, you know, all the hi-hat notes that you've put in now that you've got the 1 and 2, you could put the kick drum on some of those beats and make it a little bit. So we split it into 4, obviously the hi-hats are going into then 8, maybe mess around with 16, so the grid on most computers will be into 16s. Put the kick in some other places. I've put the kick in some other places on this preview, here's kind of what it sounds like. I also threw in a little bit of a hi-hat accent there on one of the kicks. Makes it sound a little bit more interesting. There's a lot that you can do with that beat or messing around with that beat. But some songs will call for something different. It might feel like the beat is a bit too upbeat for the song that you're writing. The easiest way around that is to do something called half-time. So you take the time that you've got, so you've got the 1, 2, 3, 4, and you're essentially doing that as half-time. But in the session you don't really, if say you're in 120 BPM, to actually do halftime, you would go down to 60 BPM. You don't really want to be messing around changing that. So the idea is that the drummer will just do it as if he's in 60 BPM, but he's not really. All that really means is instead of doing 1, 2, 3, 4, you just do 1, 3, 1, 3, and instantly you've got halftime. Reggae uses the accent on the 3 pretty much all the time. And rock songs and pop songs will use them sometimes to be a bit of a bigger, heavier thing, or even more just of a downbeat thing. It can be used in many different ways. I'll show you the first one, which is using hi-hats, which feels a bit more downbeat, and then the second one, which is actually using crash cymbals, which makes it feel like it could be part of a bigger, maybe a bridge of a song. Again, using that, you can mess around with where the kick goes, you can mess around, maybe put some extra snare accents in there, accent on the hi-hat a little bit, and you've got kind of a cool little interesting beat. So we've gone one way, we've gone for the normal beat, and then we've gone for the half time. You can actually do double time, which is more traditionally, I guess, known as more of a thrash beat. So I've actually sped up the BPM for this preview that I'm going to show you a little bit as well. The idea is that you take the kick and the snare, and instead of just doing 1, 2, 3, 4, you actually do it so that you're doing it on the and, so that you've got like kick and kick and kick and kick and Kit Kat. I nearly said Kit Kat. So that you've got essentially a very fast. You're still doing kick and then snare and then kick and then snare, but you're doing it very, very quickly, so that your kick is on beats 1, 2, 3, 4, and your snare is on the ands. I've also paired that up with a hi-hat doing the same thing. Sounds like a thrash beat. This is what it sounds like. So generally, that will be used in punk, thrash metal maybe. The more common use of that is to actually swap it over, so that now you're actually accenting on every single beat with the snare. So your 1, 2, 3, 4 is the snare, and you're using your kick as the and. So that's snare and snare and snare and snare and. Here's what that sounds like. This is more commonly used across all genres, so it's probably going to be more useful for you. Because we're essentially accenting on every single beat, because the snare is playing on every single beat, what you can do to accent a little bit more is to change what cymbal that you are playing to maybe a louder cymbal. So that's what I did in that little preview. The first snare of every 4 is on a different cymbal, so that it sounds a little bit different, so that there's a bit of separation there and that it's been accented. That's kind of the basics of beats. But there's a bit more to drums than that, because there's a thing that exists called fills. Fills are cool. Fills are the bits that's the impressive bit, the brrrr kind of shit. We have written the most basic fill that you might have ever heard. But the idea is that you can kind of take, so when we were doing the 1 and 2 and, like on the hi-hat, you can take that idea and push it over to the tom drums. So you can do a run down the tom drums, you can do across the toms and the snare, whatever. There's a lot of creativity that you can do. All fills use the tom drums, really. So every fill ever uses this. So it's a word saying that, as much as we're saying the 1 and 2 and, which is the breaks into 8, so obviously you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, and then you've got that 8 break into and. A lot of fills will use 16ths, which is an even smaller deduction of the beats. Here is the most basic fill and kind of what it looks like. I also use the kick in certain points to just kind of accent a little bit under the toms, which just makes it feel like it's a little bit more powerful. You can also do that with the snare if you really want to. What you can do is actually work the snare into your fills and maybe do bits where you're not playing a tom on certain beats, and you can mess around and go from different toms to different toms, which essentially is building a little bit more of a complex fill. This is going to be that. This I've complexed it up, taken that fill and just made it a little bit more complex. So that is just a little bit more of a complex fill. If you take the normal beat, the halftime beat, the thrash beat, but you're changing the snare and the kick round so it feels a bit more like accenting on every single beat. Use different cymbals, use your toms to fill. That's the basics of how to write drums. So even if you've never drummed before, you don't have to sit down at a kit, you don't have to have ever held sticks before, you can probably now just write some drums for your tracks. Experiment with it, try different things. What I'm saying now is kind of like the standard of what you can do with drums, but really you can do anything. And with that, there's sometimes with the programs that come with drums, some odd sounds that come with it. Sometimes you can have like weird shakers, you can have cowbells, you can have claps, whatever. You can also experiment with them to create weird sounds. We've done that. I hope you enjoyed this video. Have a good week, and I'll leave you with this.